Hey guys, tonight we're going to delve into a story that's not just about history, but about the very nature of power and downfall. Imagine a gloomy morning in London on May 19th, 1536. Thousands of people held their breath in front of the Tower of London, waiting for a horrific and unprecedented moment, the execution of a queen. Her name was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had stirred an entire empire. This event wasn't just a simple execution, it was the end of an extraordinary life. The scaffold was not built with a high platform or the familiar English axe, but with a sharp sword from France. That detail reveals the unusual nature of her death, which was fitting for her unusual life. What happened that a woman who had changed the entire religious history of England would have to face this tragic fate? We'll explore her turbulent story, from a young noblewoman to a woman who held absolute power, and finally, to a bitter defeat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the 19th of May, 1536, a tragic and unforgettable scene unfolded beneath the bleak leaden sky over London. Thousands of citizens had gathered before the Tower of London. Their hushed murmurs carried on a chill breeze as they awaited the execution of Queen Anne Boleyn. This was no ordinary execution. It marked the first time a Queen of England would meet her end on the scaffold. A shocking climax in a drama that had shaken the very foundations of the realm. The execution platform itself spoke of the extraordinary nature of the occasion. A pale wooden scaffold erected hastily overnight, lacking the customary raised platform, and, in a gesture both unusual and significant, a professional executioner summoned from France prepared to wield a sword rather than the traditional English axe. How, one might wonder, did a woman who had so profoundly transformed her kingdom, overturning centuries of ecclesiastical authority, come to this fateful morning? Within the fortress walls of the tower, Anne Boleyn awoke in the small chamber where she had been confined for the preceding 17 days. Her exact age was a matter of some debate, approximately 35 by most accounts, though some sources claimed she was 36, and others even suggested 29. Regardless of the precise number of years she had lived, she retained the grace and poise that had once captivated the most powerful monarch in England, Henry VIII. On this final dawn, a few loyal ladies-in-waiting assisted her in dressing. The garments they chose were laden with symbolism, an overgown of deep grey trimmed with fur, and beneath it, a crimson underdress. Legend holds that the rich red hue was selected so that, should the worst occur, no stain of blood would mar her dignity, a detail at once brutally practical and profoundly dignified. To understand how this queen came to such an end, it is helpful to recall her origins. Anne was born into the distinguished Boleyn family around the year 1527, though exact records are scarce. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat and courtier who served King Henry VII and later King Henry VIII, earning his knighthood through clever negotiation in the courts of Europe. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, was the daughter of the second Duke of Norfolk, a lineage steeped in noble privilege and political influence. Anne's childhood was divided between English manor houses and continental courts. She spent formative years in France and the Netherlands, absorbing the manners, languages, and learning of the Renaissance. Anne was the second of 3 children. Her elder sister, Mary Boleyn, had already caught the king's eye, serving briefly as his mistress, while her younger brother, George Boleyn, would later find himself implicated in the same charges that doomed his sister. Though Mary's liaisons at court cast a shadow over the family name, Anne staked out a different path, one defined by intellect and ambition. Fluent in French and Latin, accomplished in music and poetry, she was admired for her wit and vivacity. Yet she was not without faults. Her ambition sometimes tipped into pride, and her refusal to settle for the role of royal mistress earned her both respect and resentment. It was around the year 1530 that Anne returned to England from her service abroad. By then, she had become a lady of considerable reputation, esteemed by ambassadors for her charm and scorned by conservative courtiers for her outspokenness. The king, still wed to Catherine of Aragon and desperate for a male heir, grew fascinated by Anne's intelligence and resolve. She made her famous declaration, "If you wish to have me, write crown on my forehead." It was a bold gambit, that ultimately led to their secret marriage in January 1533, following Henry's break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. As Queen, Anne's good qualities shone. She championed religious reform, supported the translation of the Bible into English, and patronized scholars and artists. Her vivacious spirit enlivened court life, and her compassion extended to those in need. Yet her imperfections were equally evident. Her sharp tongue could alienate allies, her impatience with court protocol fueled rumors of impropriety, and her inability to provide a surviving male heir drove the king to frustration. Thus, on that somber morning in May, the life of a woman whose marriage had reshaped a nation reached its bitter end. Inside the thick walls of the Tower, Anne Boleyn's story, woven from noble lineage, youthful promise, political revolution, and personal tragedy, was poised to close with a single, irrevocable act. On the 19th of May, 1536, at the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn faced the final dawn of her life. After 17 long days confined within a narrow chamber's shadowed walls, she awoke with the gentle assistance of the few ladies in waiting who had remained steadfastly loyal. In that dim, cold morning light, at about 35 years of age, she still possessed the grace and refined beauty that once captivated King Henry VIII himself. Her dress was chosen with profound symbolism, an outer gown of deep grey trimmed with soft fur, enveloping her slender form, and beneath it a crimson underdress, its rich hue meant to conceal any stain of blood, a final act of dignity and courage in the face of her coming end. Before stepping onto the scaffold, Anne displayed astonishing fortitude. With a wry, almost playful smile, she quipped, "I hear the executioner is quite skilled. My neck is rather small." The gesture of her delicate fingers brushing her throat, both self-deprecating and defiant, was recorded by onlookers and endures today as a testament to her unbroken spirit. In that brief, ironic moment, she confronted the inexorable reality of her sentence with poise and sharp wit. Yet beneath that brave facade lay an excruciating heartache. At 8 o'clock that morning, word arrived that her execution would be postponed until noon. This cruel delay stretched the agony of waiting into torturous hours. Anne knelt in prayer, clutching her rosary beads, the rhythmic tap of her Hail Marys mingling with the distant rumble of the city. She received Holy Communion, the consecrated wafer a small comfort amid the vast injustice she faced. Time and again she spoke her solemn oath. Before William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, she swore upon the sacrament, "For the salvation of my soul, I have never betrayed the king." That declaration, echoing in the chilly confines of her cell, rang out as both affirmation of her innocence and testament to an unshakable faith. Anne's so-called crimes were manifold: alleged adultery with multiple men, a scandalous accusation that even named her own brother, George Boleyn, among the supposed lovers, charges of treason, as if she had conspired against the king's life, accusations of witchcraft and heresy, insinuating that she had employed dark arts to ensnare the monarch's heart. Yet every one of these indictments rested on flimsy testimony and political machinations rather than truth. In an era when rumour and fear carried as much weight as fact, her enemies wove a tapestry of lies so elaborate that few dared question its threads. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, marshalled these false charges to remove her from power, perhaps to serve the ambitions of others at court, perhaps at the behest of a restless monarch seeking a new consort. The injustice of her predicament was staggering. Anne had been a catalyst for England's greatest religious upheaval in centuries. Her insistence that Henry grant her a crown rather than reduce her to the role of mistress led to the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. She had championed the translation of Scripture into the vernacular, opening God's word to common folk. She had supported poets, scholars, and reformers, nurturing a renaissance of learning within the palace walls. Yet in the end, these very achievements were twisted into evidence of her supposed ambition and manipulation proof. Her accusers claimed that she sought to usurp authority over both church and state. Despite her remarkable fortitude, the toll of this falsehood weighed heavily on her fragile frame. Those who witnessed her final hours noted the pallor of her cheeks and the tremor in her hands as she clutched her prayer book. The crimson underdress, once a symbol of steadfast dignity, must have reminded her of the blood that awaited. Yet even then, she did not falter. In whispered prayers, she commended her soul to God, seeking mercy and justice beyond this earthly tribunal. Her cry, "Lord, have mercy on me," encapsulated both her vulnerability and her unwavering trust. As the appointed hour approached, Anne emerged from her cell and ascended the scaffold's steps with measured calm. The sleek blade of the French executioner's sword shimmered in the pale sunlight, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the severity of ending a queen's life. Anne paused at the edge of the platform, surveying the gathered crowd. Though thousands had assembled, their hats were doffed in a rare moment of collective reverence. In that hush, she raised her voice one final time, addressing bystanders with words that blended humility and resilience. "Good Christian people, I come hither to die. According to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler or more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was always a good, gentle, and sovereign lord." These closing remarks, preserved by chroniclers, revealed Anne's most profound injustice, that even as she stood accused of conspiring against the crown, her loyalty to Henry persisted until the end. Her public plea for the king's welfare quietly insisted on her integrity and cast a mournful light on the falsehoods that had destroyed her. Without waiting for a response, she knelt and surrendered herself to her fate. In a final gesture, she offered a small purse of gold to the executioner, a payment for his grim service, and perhaps a gift of forgiveness. And so, on that sombre afternoon, Anne Boleyn's life was severed with a single, precise stroke. Yet her death only deepened the story of her remarkable journey. Her courage amid betrayal, her dignity in the face of cruelty, and the injustices that led a queen to her untimely demise. Though her body lay beneath the cold stones of the chapel floor, her legacy of faith, reform, and unbroken spirit would echo through England's history long after the echo of that blade had faded. In those final, fragile hours of her life, Anne Boleyn revealed a singular combination of wit and unyielding resolve that seemed almost otherworldly. The air about the Tower of London lay heavy with mist, a pale grey veil that blurred the edges of stone battlements and the distant Thames. The dawn chorus of timid birds offered a tenuous comfort, their soft calls drifting through the iron-grilled window of her cramped cell. Beyond those bars, guards paced with measured steps, their boots echoing on the cobblestones like the steady tick of a relentless clock counting down to noon. In this hushed, trembling world, Anne's luminous spirit shone most clearly. One of the most unforgettable moments occurred just after dawn, when she summoned the courage to address the dark gathering with a morsel of dark humour. In a voice both gentle and cutting, she quipped, "I hear the executioner is quite skilled. My neck is rather small." Witnesses later recorded how she raised a slender hand to her throat as she spoke, the gesture transforming a scene of bleak inevitability into a triumph of self-possession. The shifting mist seemed to part for her, as she stood beneath the raised scaffold, a pale wooden stage poised against the skyline, turning a spectacle of punishment into a fleeting testament to her own dignity. Yet that brief spark of levity could not dispel the chill of dread. At 8 o'clock in the morning, word arrived that the execution would not take place until 12 o'clock. This unexpected postponement struck like an icy wind, extending the agony of anticipation through the silent hours. Anne had steeled herself for the morning light, for the swift arrival of death's final summons. Now she faced a cruel interlude in which each moment stretched out, rife with unanswered questions and the relentless ticking of distant clocks. The weary rays of the sun, filtered through the high, narrow windows, crept across the damp stones, marking the slow passage of each harrowing minute. During this cruel wait, Anne turned inward, seeking solace in the faith that had guided her through every tumultuous turn of fortune. She knelt upon the cold flagstones of her chamber, her gown pooling around her like a river of grey and crimson, and clasped her hands in fervent prayer. A small, worn missal lay open before her, illuminated by the dim glow of a single trembling taper. The aroma of melting wax mingled with the faint tang of dew that seeped through the ancient walls, creating a sensory tapestry that seemed to hold time itself hemmed in. Witnesses later recounted how Anne repeated, in a voice both firm and trembling, "Lord, have mercy on me." Again and again, she petitioned the heavens. each invocation a soft plea against the storm of injustice that bore down upon her. Her lips moved steadily through the prayers of the faithful, the rhythmic cadence of Hail Marys and Our Fathers rising and falling like the gentle lapping of river water against stone embankments. Amid these whispered devotions, she made a solemn vow before the Blessed Sacrament, swearing that she had never betrayed the King. "For the salvation of my soul, I have never been disloyal," she affirmed, her voice ringing with the quiet authority of one who possessed an unshakable conscience. Later, when William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, entered her cell to confirm her resolve, Anne repeated her oath with even greater determination. "I am innocent of the things of which I stand accused." Kingston, a man accustomed to the rigid demands of duty, paused at the strength of her conviction. The stone walls, which had echoed only with the clank of chains and the low murmur of guards, now bore witness to her declaration of integrity. In that moment, the weight of the castle stone seemed to lighten, as if the very air conspired to carry her words beyond the confines of her prison. Outside, a hush had descended upon the Tower Green. Distant church bells tolling the hour seemed more solemn, more portentous. Courtiers and commoners alike pressed forward, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the mourner queen. A single shaft of pale sunlight broke through the overcast sky, illuminating the scaffold in an almost spectral glow. The assembled crowd, stirred by Anne's earlier remark and her steadfast prayers, exchanged glances of both sorrow and awe. Murmurs spread through the throng. Some lamented the injustice, others whispered prayers for her soul. Back in her chamber, Anne spent the remaining hours in quiet reflection. She seemed to glide between moments of gentle repose, eyes closed, head bowed in silent communion, and fleeting instances of razor-sharp focus, recalling the faces of her children, the echo of palace corridors, the warmth of candlelight on tapestries. She traced the lines of her own life in memory. The joyful promise of her youth at the French court, the heady days of ascending to the throne, the thrill of religious reform, and then the harsh descent into accusation. Each recollection was both balm and burden, comforting in its familiarity yet painful in its finality. As the mist thickened once again and the hour of noon approached, Anne rose with serene determination. She donned her outer gown and crimson underdress one last time, fastening each fur trim with deliberate care, as though preparing for a ceremony of profound significance. The ambulant guards outside drew breath in unison, aware that the hours of waiting were nearly done. Anne lifted her head, eyes reflecting both sorrow and defiance, and stepped toward the chamber door. In that final passage from cell to scaffold, the small torch she carried cast dancing shadows upon the cold stone, marking the path of a queen who, even in her last moments, held fast to wit, faith, and an unwavering claim to her own innocence. To understand the meteoric rise and tragic fall of Anne Boleyn, one must first wander through the corridors of her upbringing and education, for there lie the seeds of both her brilliance and her undoing. Born around the year 1527, Anne was the second child of Sir Thomas Boleyn, a cunning and ambitious diplomat, and Lady Elizabeth Howard, scion of the powerful Howard family. Though she entered the world in noble surroundings, her path diverged from that of her peers early on, guided by an education as unconventional as it was enlightening for a young woman of her station. Anne's childhood unfolded in two distinct realms, the polished courts of France and, to a lesser extent, the sprawling courts of the Netherlands. These continental courts were the very heart of Renaissance culture, where poets recited odes beneath gilded ceilings, where lute music drifted through candlelit galleries, and where every gesture and phrase carried a subtle weight of sophistication. It was here, among the courtiers and ladies-in-waiting of the French king, that Anne first imbibed the manners, languages, and intellectual currents that would later set her apart at Henry's court. Imagine the hush of a Renaissance morning at the Palace of Fontainebleau, the air still touched with dawn's mist. Anne, perhaps only 12 or 13 at the time, would walk through terraced gardens dew-laden with budding blooms, her footfall soft on the stone pathways. She would pause by fountains dripping with water like liquid crystal, listening to the distant echo of birdsong against the ribbed vaults of the palace. Under the tutelage of learned preceptors, she mastered French and Italian, studied the classics of antiquity, and learned to navigate courtly intrigue with a quiet confidence. In the salons where women of noble birth debated theology and translated scripture into the vernacular, Anne honed a sharp mind that thirsted for knowledge beyond embroidery and dance. By the time she ventured to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, Anne's reputation as a cultured and articulate young woman preceded her. The Netherlandish court, known for its sober decorum and devout spirituality, offered a contrast to France's flamboyant pageantry. Here, Anne encountered scholars and statesmen, observed the meticulous administration of a sprawling duchy, and learned to differentiate sincere piety from opportunistic politicking. Amid the echoing halls of Mechelen, she absorbed lessons in diplomacy and governance that would mark her later interventions in English religious reform. When Anne returned to England around the year 1530, she brought with her not only the elegance of continental courtiers, but also their spirit of inquiry. Her arrival in Henry's realm, however, did not coincide with immediate admiration for her appearance. By the aesthetic standards of the era, those dazzled by pale complexions and flaxen hair, Anne's dark skin and raven hair set her apart. Ambassadors such as the Venetian Francesco Sanuto noted that she was not among the most comely women in the world, describing her as possessing a long neck, a wide mouth, and a bosom not greatly raised. Yet even his clinical account conceded that her eyes were black and beautiful, and that she had an allure far transcending mere physical beauty. It was precisely this magnetic presence, this confluence of intellect, poise, and conviction that drew attention to Anne more than any conventional charm. She spoke multiple languages fluently, including Latin, enabling her to quote scripture or Cicero with equal ease. Her manner was unforced yet commanding. She could silence a room with a well-timed anecdote or win allies with a gracious compliment. Courtiers whispered of her vivacity, a term that hinted at both her spirited humour and her willful spirit. Yet Anne's gifts came at a price. In an England still reeling from the demands of dynastic security and the stern traditions of medieval piety, a woman who dared to debate theology or to suggest changes in liturgy risked suspicion. Her continental manners, so prized in Paris, were sometimes deemed too forward, too unconventional, for the insular court at Westminster. Beneath the surface of her courteous smile lay a determination that could be read as ambition. The very talents that incited admiration among thinkers and reformers kindled jealousy in the hearts of more traditional courtiers and clergy. Consider the grand hall of Hampton Court in the late days of 1532. Tapestries heavy with crimson and gold hung between carved wooden panels, flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows. Anne, now queen, might pace such a chamber in gowns of rich brocade, conversing with bishops in French on the merits of vernacular scripture. Her words echoed against the high ceilings, disrupting the hush that once reigned over Henry's ecclesiastical council. To reformers, she was a breath of fresh air. To conservatives, she was a tempest threatening the ancient order. Anne's unique blend of erudition and vulnerability further fueled perceptions of her as a double-edged sword. She was no courtly automaton, but a living embodiment of human complexity. At once gracious to the poor, merciless to her enemies, devout in private prayer, and audacious in public discourse. In her letters to friends abroad, she expressed longing for genuine affection and lamented the precariousness of her position. Yet in private audiences with the king, she could strike a balance between humility and influence, pressing him gently to advance religious reform while never forgetting to acknowledge his superiority. Thus, the stage was set for Anne's fateful ascent, a woman shaped by the twin fires of Renaissance humanism and continental sophistication, who returned to England bearing the fruits of an education beyond her peers. Her very different dark hair amidst a sea of pale heads, measured French prudence amid English formality, became a beacon that shone in Henry's restless court. But it also painted a target upon her back, for any figure who alters the course of church and state must bear the weight of both admiration and envy. In those heady days of early 1533, Anne's intelligence and courtly grace were exalted as the king's treasure. She inspired sermons in London's churches and learned debates within Oxford's halls. She championed translations of sacred texts and patronized artists whose canvases glowed with newfound Protestant fervor. Yet, as her star rose, so too did the shadows of suspicion and resentment. Those who once admired her brilliance began to whisper of hubris and heresy. In the twilight between loyalty and betrayal, Anne Boleyn stood at the center of a kingdom in flux. Her triumphs as luminous as her impending downfall would be sudden and cruel. So, To trace Anne's journey from childhood confidant of Renaissance monarchs to queen at the epicenter of English Reformation, one must walk those misty palace corridors and hear the echoes of her footsteps. Her education was her greatest gift and her most dangerous legacy, laying bare the fragile line between enlightened progress and irrevocable ruin in a world unready for a woman of such formidable talents. Although stories of Anne Boleyn often swirl around her famed charm and courtly allure, the reality of her appearance was far more nuanced than the simple portrait of a Renaissance beauty might suggest. When Anne returned to England around the year 1522, she stepped onto English soil bearing features that diverged sharply from the era's prevailing standards. In the flickering torchlight of Westminster Hall and the soft glow of candlelit corridors at Hampton Court, courtly whispers compared her to the ideal of alabaster skin and golden tresses favoured by poets and painters alike. Yet Anne's complexion was sun-kissed with olive undertones, her hair a cascade of dark chestnut, not the honeyed blonde of myth, and her eyes glimmered with an intense coal-black depth, rather than the cool blue prized by those who long to see the fair, almost translucent countenance of a Renaissance lady. Imagine the hushed hush of a summer's evening at Greenwich Palace, where showcases of courtly fashion paraded in rows along the embroidered benches. Gentlewomen in gowns of ivory satin and embroidered silk, their fair hair bound in pearly nets, whispered secrets as Anne approached, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of lanterns. She walked with a vigour and confidence that seemed to illuminate every footstep, yet her very presence, distinct from the pale, rounded beauties admired in the tinted sketches of foreign ambassadors, drew the eye precisely because she did not conform. One Venetian diplomat, Francesco Sanuto, penned a rather unflattering account in his dispatches, noting that Anne was not among the handsomest women in the world, and describing her as of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, and a bosom not much raised. In his austere view, she lacked the ample fullness and radiant pallor that courtiers celebrated. But to reduce her to such words alone would be to ignore the vibrant energy that animated her features. In the tapestry-lit audience chamber, while others fanned themselves in sweltering heat, she might engage a visiting scholar in fluent French, her dark eyes alight with curiosity, her smile both knowing and warm. The French poet Lancelot de Lille, or as he is more familiarly called, Lancelot Dalle, offered a more generous appraisal. He described Anne as beautiful with an elegant figure, praising not merely her appearance but the grace of her movements, the subtleties of her expression. In his eyes, the tilt of her head, or the slight lift of an eyebrow, conveyed a beauty far richer than mere symmetry. This admiration, recorded in flowing verse, suggests that Anne's allure stemmed from a harmony of mind and manner, a combination of sharp intelligence and artful comportment that transcended the narrow conventions of physical perfection. Even the grand tapestries that adorned the Great Hall of Greenwich seemed to echo her distinctive presence. Scenes of hunting expeditions and courtly dances depicted noblewomen in soft pastels rose pink, dove grey, pale blue, yet Anne's personal garments often bore deeper hues. Burgundy velvets edged in gold thread, sombre greys shot through with silver trim. Such colours flattered neither her pale skin nor her dark hair, according to the latest French fashion plates, but they complemented the depth of her gaze and the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. Yet, for all the sophistication of her appearance, a chorus of malicious rumours sought to tarnish Anne's reputation. Whispers among courtiers told of a deformed finger, an extra joint awkwardly angled, or of a large, conspicuous mole on her cheek. These legends, later repeated in scurrilous pamphlets, were fabrications concocted after her fall, intended to undermine her dignity and justify her brutal removal. Imagine a dim alley behind a tavern near Westminster, where gutter spirits exchanged lurid tales in hushed tones, the amber lamp overhead flickering as if recoiling from such slanders. In those huddled conversations, Anne's enemies wielded rumour as a weapon, eager to reduce her from queen to common target. None of these allegations withstood scrutiny, however. Years later, when her alleged remains were found during the renovation of the Chapel Street, Peter ad Vincula, experts confirmed a skeleton whose slender bones bore no sign of deformity. And the mole so often spoken of as if a badge of dishonour was never mentioned in contemporary portraits or household inventories. Those inventions, born of spite, served only to highlight the desperation of those who would see her erased from history. In truth, Anne's unique blend of features marked her as a striking figure among the courtiers of early 1533. Her dark hair was often bound in a French-style coif, its glossy waves secured beneath jewelled pins, and her black eyes, so frequently dismissed by foreign envoys, quenched themselves in the rich hues of her clothing. Her skin, neither the rosy pallor of youthful innocence nor the dazzling whiteness of foreign fashion plates, was a warm canvas upon which her lively expressions played. One might picture her standing in the garden at Greenwich, the scent of roses and lavender all around, her silhouette framed against the green arches and stone fountains. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across her dark attire, illuminating the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the gentle curve of her neck, the very neck she would later refer to with such wry humour. Her intelligence, too, hovered around her like an aura. She was well versed in Latin, Greek and scripture, able to converse with clerics on matters of theology and with ambassadors on points of law. In the library at Whitehall Palace, where shelves groaned beneath the weight of vellum-bound tomes, Anne might discuss the latest treatise on church reform, her voice resonant even in the hush of scholarly study. The flicker of candlelight on polished oak tables bore witness to her fervent reading, and the meticulous notes she penned a testament to a mind that sought not idle flattery, but substantive engagement with the issues of her day. Physically, Anne's presence was often described with words that revealed more about the observer than the observed. When she entered the great hall for dinner, her steps measured and assured, the courtiers who awaited her carriage paused in their conversations. The rustle of her skirts against the stone floor, matched with the soft jingle of her jewelled girdle, announced her arrival. As she passed tables laden with roasted venison and gilt trenchers, she nodded graciously to the servants, who curtsied with respect, recognizing the Queen's quiet authority. Yet in her wake, the murmurs of admiration and envy followed, some praising her poetic wit, others railing against her foreign airs, still more intrigued by the compelling mystery of a woman who did not fit the mould but transcended it. Thus, the paradox of Anne's beauty emerges. She was neither classically radiant nor conventionally flawless, and yet she became the most talked-about woman in England. It was as though the very deviations in her appearance, her darker tones, her slender frame acted as a beacon, calling forth admiration from those who valued depth and intellect over mere ornament. When Henry VIII first set eyes on her, he saw not a pale reflection of every queen before her, but a new and invigorating presence, one whose difference he found irresistibly captivating. In the tapestry of Tudor court life, where alliances shifted like the flicker of candlelight, and every gesture might carry the weight of treason or devotion, Anne's distinctive appearance was but one thread. Woven together with her sharp mind, her refined manner, and her unwavering confidence, it produced a figure both luminous and lasting, a queen whose legacy outshone the petty judgments of her contemporaries and remains vivid even in the softest glow of history's memory. In the cool dawn of a spring morning in 1526, the court of King Henry VIII stirred beneath a sky the colour of polished pewter. Within the lofty halls of Greenwich Palace, courtly life unfolded in a ritual as old as the Tudor dynasty itself. Nobles and ladies glided upon cool marble floors, their silken gowns whispering secrets as they passed, and the ornate scent of burning myrrh mingled with the crisp air drifting through latticed windows. Yet amidst these familiar patterns, a new tension crackled, invisible yet palpable. The king's gaze had fallen upon a woman whose quiet resolve would soon reshape the very soul of England. Henry VIII had reigned beside Catherine of Aragon for many years, their marriage sealed by devotion and dynastic necessity, yet the royal cradle remained empty of the male heir, whose promise would secure the Tudor line. Though Catherine bore a daughter, Mary, the Tudor succession still trembled on a knife's edge, and the king's courtiers whispered of the realm's fragility. It was in this climate of urgency and longing that Henry first encountered Anne Boleyn, the younger sister of Mary Boleyn, the king's former mistress. But Anne's demeanour differed starkly from that of her sister. Where Mary had offered herself and then been set aside, Anne bore herself with a dignity that both intrigued and challenged the monarch. Imagine the stately gardens of Richmond upon Thames, paths lined with tulips and hyacinths nodding gently in the breeze. Courtiers promenaded along the sunlit walkways, eager to catch the king's favour by identifying the newest object of his affection. Mary Boleyn, once the centre of Henry's attentions, had faded like an autumn leaf. Anne, by contrast, moved through these gardens with a poise that halted even the most seasoned diplomat. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, seemed to measure each gesture and glance. She did not bow too deeply. She did not solicit favour with coy glances. Instead, she spoke her mind with the soft authority of a woman convinced of her own worth. When Henry's interest intensified, Anne found herself at the centre of a dangerous courtly game. To become the king's mistress, an accepted, if unofficial, station would have been the simpler path. Her sister had walked that road, reaping fleeting acclaim and a measure of influence, only to be cast aside when the king's passions shifted. Anne, however, understood all too well the precariousness of that role. She perceived that to be mistress was to exchange dignity for momentary advantage, and that no guarantee of lasting security lay in the king's caprice. Thus she refused overtures and invitations, setting herself apart with a quiet firmness that both flattered and infuriated Henry. The pivotal moment came one day in the great hall at Whitehall, where courtiers had assembled for a banquet. Tapestries depicting the Tudor rose glowed behind clustered candles, and the carved wooden seats bore the weight of eager spectators. Henry, decked in robes of crimson velvet, signalled Anne to approach. The hush that fell was almost sacred, as though the hall itself held its breath. In that charged silence, Anne delivered her fateful words. "I will not be your mistress. If you wish to have me, you must crown me." The simple clarity of her demand, as bold as any declaration on a battlefield, struck the assembled nobles like the toll of a distant bell. It was not merely a plea for elevation. It was a challenge, an unspoken assertion that she would accept nothing less than sovereign status. Henry, enthralled and unnerved, found himself at a crossroads from which the path back would be forever barred. To grant Anne a crown would require dissolving his marriage to Catherine, a union blessed by the Church and bound by papal dispensation. The prospect of an annulment, let alone full divorce, sent ripples of consternation through Europe. The Spanish king, Charles V, Catherine's nephew, loomed like an angry spectre in the background, and Rome frowned upon any action that undermined its authority. Yet Henry's obsession, fueled by his desire for a male heir, and for Anne's indomitable spirit, drove him forward. For 7 years, between 1526 and 1533, Henry pursued Anne with a relentless ardour. The court became a stage for private negotiations and public posturing. Ambassadors penned dispatches in gilded script, reporting every nuance of Anne's compliance or resistance. In the sunlit cloisters of Westminster Abbey, secret envoys sought to secure dispensations. In candle-lit scribal chambers, legal treatises on divorce and ecclesiastical law were debated with fevered intensity. The corridors of power echoed with murmured confidences and speculations. Could England sever its sacred ties to Rome? Would the king risk excommunication to obtain a crown and a son? Amidst this tempest, Anne did not simply wait. She engaged the era's brightest minds, scholars versed in canon law, theologians conversant in Scripture's subtleties, and invited their counsel. In the hushed libraries of Lambeth Palace, she pored over treatises on the authority of monarchs as vicars of Christ on earth. By the light of flickering candles, she studied the writings of Erasmus and Tyndale, seeking arguments that might justify Henry's cause. Never passive, she became an active agent in the transformation that swirled around the throne. In the end, Henry's determination and Anne's fortitude broke the bonds tying England to the papacy. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, declared the king to be the supreme head of the Church of England, a title that placed him above Rome's reach in matters spiritual and temporal. Monasteries were dissolved, abbey lands confiscated, and the silver and gold once destined for the Vatican flowed instead into royal coffers. This sweeping reformation rippled through every parish. Villagers who long prayed in Latin now heard sermons in English. New service books replaced ancient missals, and the familiar toll of distant church bells took on a new resonance, heralding not only worship but the dawn of an autonomous Anglican faith. Anne's ascent to the throne in January of 1533 was thus far more than a personal triumph. It was the capstone of a revolution that remade England's spiritual landscape. As queen, she wore her crown not merely as a token of affection, but as a badge of office, presiding over courtly assemblies with keen intelligence. In the candlelit Hall of Greenwich, she received foreign ambassadors, each one struck by her fluency in French and her deft handling of diplomatic pleasantries. Portraits captured her slender form clad in crimson velvet, her dark hair bound under a coif woven with pearls, her black eyes brimming with purpose. Yet Anne's crown was forged in conflict and bound in controversy. To her admirers, she was a visionary who helped forge a new monarchy, one unshackled from foreign domination. To her enemies, she was a usurper and a heretic, accused of manipulating the king's affections for her own ends. Within the carved oak panels of Hampton Court, factions formed in hushed corners, some praising her patronage of scholars and reformers, others plotting the undoing of her influence. The same vigour that had spurred her insistence on a crown now fueled the resentments that would lead to her downfall. Thus the story of Anne's rise is woven inseparably with Henry's quest for both a queen and a son. It was a gamble of staggering risk, a gamble that demanded the severance of ancient allegiances and the birth of a new church. In those 7 years of pursuit, love and law, Anne Boleyn transformed from a captive of her family's ambitions into the catalyst of a national conversion. She stood at the centre of a maelstrom that shattered the old order, crafting a monarchy in which the king himself would stand supreme both in state and in spirit. And even as her fate would turn grim, her bold wager on a crown rather than a mere dalliance reshaped the destiny of England for centuries to come. The marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn stands among the most transformative events in English history, for it ignited the very birth of the Church of England. Their 7-year courtship was no mere romantic dalliance. It unfolded as a dramatic contest of wills between a sovereign monarch and the distant authority of the Vatican. To wed Anne and legitimize their union, Henry faced a formidable obstacle, his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That union, sealed by papal dispensation, had endured for years, yet bore no surviving male heir. As the English countryside stirred awake beneath soft mists, Henry's desperation grew, and he petitioned Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine. The king dispatched envoys bearing sumptuous gifts, silken gowns, jewelled reliquaries, and barrels of English wine, hoping to sway the Pope's decision. They traversed the sun-baked courts of Rome, their polished boots clicking on marble floors, and whispered in frescoed antechambers, only to meet repeated refusal. For Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, an ally whose favour the Pope could ill afford to alienate. That papal rejection struck Henry like a thunderbolt on a clear day. In the great hall of Windsor Castle, where tapestries depicting King Arthur's court hung silent, the king paced beneath carved beams, wrestling with a choice that would reshape the realm's spiritual and political landscape. The incense haze still lingered from morning prayers, but Henry's thoughts turned to his promise of succession and his pledge to Anne. To pursue his desire, he would have to sever ties with Rome entirely. In the year 1534, Henry assembled Parliament in the chilly stone chamber of Westminster. Courtiers wrapped in velvet cloaks murmured among themselves as the king, resplendent in robes of scarlet and ermine, delivered his momentous decree. The Act of Supremacy declared the monarch to be the supreme head of the Church of England. In a voice echoing off high arches, Henry proclaimed that no foreign potentate, not even the Pope, could claim authority over English spiritual affairs. The atmosphere crackled with both excitement and dread, as bishops and nobles processed the implications. Monasteries, once wealthier than many principalities, now stood outside the Pope's protection. Across the green fields of England, word of the new church spread like wildfire. In villages where thatched cottages lined narrow lanes, priests exchanged furtive glances as parishioners gathered for morning mass. The familiar Latin liturgy gave way to services in English, its cadence both comforting and strange to those unaccustomed to hearing scripture proclaimed in their mother tongue. Rustic wooden pews creaked under the weight of curious farmers, while in stately cathedrals the stained glass windows filtered dawn's light, casting kaleidoscopic patterns onto polished stone floors. The Revolution's immediate effects were seismic. Monasteries, once centres of learning, hospitality, and charity, were dissolved. At Fountains Abbey, monks watched in stunned silence as royal commissioners catalogued their Bibles and chalices before departing with carts laden with silver plate. In the courtyard of Glastonbury, nuns wept softly as they bid farewell to walled gardens filled with medicinal herbs. The lands and treasures of these religious houses were swiftly seized by the crown, funneling wealth into royal coffers and, in some cases, into the hands of eager courtiers. Resistance flickered in hidden corners. Some devout retainers refused the oath of supremacy, choosing imprisonment over compliance. In the damp dungeons of the Tower of London, whispers passed among condemned priests, their chains clinking in rhythm with the drip of unseen water. Outside, their families clutched rosaries, praying that their loved ones might be spared the gallows or the scaffold. Henry's government, wary of dissent, enacted stern measures. Pamphlets denouncing the new church were burned, and those who persisted in allegiance to Rome faced fines, loss of property, or worse. Amid this tumult, Anne Boleyn emerged, not as a mere ornament of courtly intrigue, but as an ardent champion of reform. In the candlelit study of Greenwich Palace, she received scholars and theologians, urging them to translate the scriptures into English so that even the humblest peasant might read God's word for himself. The alchemical glow of candle flames danced across her face as she pored over Latin manuscripts, annotating passages in the margins with a deft hand. She listened to debates on clerical celibacy and the sacrament of matrimony, her dark eyes alight with curiosity and conviction. Anne's presence at state ceremonies underscored her role as more than a royal consort. She stood as advocate for a church governed by English law and English bishops. In processions through city streets, she walked beneath a canopy of gold, her gown of rich velvet bearing the embroidered arms of England and Boleyn combined. Citizens lined the cobblestone thoroughfares, craning their necks to glimpse the queen who had helped transform the nation's faith. Children ran alongside gilded carriages, their laughter mingling with the muffled chants of chantry choirs. Yet, Anne's influence was not without controversy. Critics accused her of promoting heresy, claiming that her support for vernacular scripture endangered the souls of the unwary. Tory clergymen preached fiercely against that Lady of Boleyn, warning their flocks that the old faith was under siege. In rustic taverns, where ale flowed generously, travellers recounted rumours of veiled masses in forest glades, held by priests in secret as the revolution of faith gathered pace. The countryside, once placid beneath the sway of centuries-old traditions, now simmered with ideological conflict. Still, the tide of reform proved unstoppable. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a learned cleric installed by Henry's decree, issued the 10 Articles, laying out a blueprint for Anglican belief. Parishioners in churches from York to Canterbury listened as the creed was read aloud in English, their hearts stirred by the notion that they, too, could partake directly in divine mysteries. In the hush of those congregations, the drums of change beat steadily, echoing the sovereign's decree that England would no longer bow to foreign prelates. Through it all, Anne Boleyn stood as both catalyst and witness. She celebrated the dissolution of monasteries not with triumphalism, but with a measured hope that their riches might be put to better use funding schools, hospitals, and the poor. She called upon nobility to embrace the new order, to support the king's vision of a national church that served both crown and country. In her chambers at Greenwich, she received reports of plundered abbeys and redirected tithes, tracking the transformation of England's spiritual and material wealth. Yet beneath the fervour of Reformation lay a simmering tension. As monasteries closed and abbots dispersed, local economies trembled. Artisans who once crafted chalices and vestments found their livelihoods threatened. In market squares, vendors of illuminated manuscripts lamented the decline of Latin commissions, while markets for new prayer books in English burst forth to fill the void. The very fabric of society stretched and strained, accommodating shifts in power, faith, and custom. By the time Anne and Henry exchanged their vows in January 1533, the Church of England had already taken root. The papal tiara's authority receded like a shadow at dusk, replaced by the king's royal crest adorning altars and lecterns. In the high vault of St. Paul's Cathedral, the bishop intoned the new oath of loyalty, and the congregation responded with fervent accord. Across cathedrals and parish churches, the bells rang not only for the Queen's coronation, but for a new dawn in which England stood sovereign in matters of the soul. Thus, the union of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn transcended mere matrimonial alliance. It became the instrument of a revolution in faith, a seismic redefinition of church and state that would echo through the centuries. Anne, far from being a passive beneficiary of royal favour, shaped the course of events with her intellect, conviction, and steadfast belief in English spiritual independence. In the hushed corridors of history, her legacy endures as that of a catalyst who turned personal ambition into a national transformation, one that severed ties to Rome and forged a church and a realm forever changed. Becoming Queen of England in January 1533, Anne Boleyn's reign lasted but 3 short years, yet the imprint she left upon the realm was both deep and enduring. Imagine the hush that fell over Westminster Abbey on that January morning, as candlelight pooled around vaulted pillars and the hush of velvet robes brushing against stone echoed through the nave. Anne stepped forward to kneel before the altar, clutching the edges of her crimson velvet kirtle trimmed with gold, while courtiers and clergy in richly embroidered doublets and gowns watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. In that moment, she was more than a consort. She was a symbol of a new era, a living emblem of change that challenged centuries of tradition. From her elevated position, Anne set about using every tool at her disposal to accelerate the course of religious reform. Within the hushed chambers of Greenwich Palace's council room, she met with scholars fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, men whose fingers traced delicate lines in musty manuscripts by candlelight. Anne championed the translation of the Holy Scriptures into English, arguing that the Word of God should not be restricted to scholars and priests alone, but should be held in the open hands of every layperson. Think of the quiet, wood-panelled scriptoriums in Canterbury and Oxford, where scribes laboured through candlelit nights to reproduce copies of the New Testament in English, their quills scratching over parchment while the wind howled outside ancient mullioned windows. In remote parish churches, villagers who once struggled to understand Latin Mass now heard familiar phrases in their own tongue, phrases that rolled off the tongue with newfound immediacy. Her patronage extended beyond the sacred texts. In the carved library of Hampton Court, where rows of oak shelves groaned beneath the weight of leather-bound folios, Anne hosted lectures on theology and poetry. Noblemen and gentlewomen gathered in the glow of wrought-iron chandeliers, listening raptly as scholars expounded on Augustine's treatises or recited lines from Petrarch's sonnets. It was said that her keen mind and graceful wit could redirect any debate, turning diffuse chatter into focused inquiry about the nature of faith, the responsibilities of rulers, and the destiny of the English soul. Artisans and printers, emboldened by royal favour, set up presses in London's winding streets, their presses thudding out pamphlets and primers that circulated from Kent to Cornwall. To her admirers, Anne emerged as a visionary, a woman whose courage and foresight ignited the hopes of reformers across the land. In taverns where weary travellers paused to sip ale by the firelight, the name Queen Anne was spoken with reverence. Minstrels composed ballads that praised her as a gentle sovereign, while devout groups quietly formed to discuss the implications of English sermons replacing Latin liturgies. Across the dells of Yorkshire, in the shadow of Street, Cuthbert's Cathedral, villagers gathered to hear itinerant preachers read the English Bible under their breath, their faces alight with wonder and trepidation. Yet for every voice raised in praise, a chorus of accusation and calumny rose in opposition. In the stiffly carpeted corridors of the royal court, conservative clergymen vested in silken surplices and clutching gilded breviaries bristled at Anne's influence. They whispered of her as a manipulator who wielded her charms to seduce the king and steer him away from true faith. In clandestine gatherings, accusations bloomed like poisonous flowers, that she was a heretic, a schemer, a false prophet who corroded the foundations of holy tradition. Pamphlets smeared her name with lurid tales of clandestine rites and perfidious counsel, their crudely printed letters appearing like blots of scandal across the newly established network of presses. Amid these clashing perspectives, historian Emily Lane Rousseau encourages a more balanced appraisal. In her meticulous studies, Rousseau highlights how Anne's actions must be viewed within the fraught dynamics between her and Henry VIII. Anne did not pursue reform out of mere ideological zeal, Rousseau argues, but also as a calculated effort to secure her own safety and that of her family. Consider the tense nights when Anne lay awake in her bedchamber at Greenwich, the fur-lined curtains drawn against the autumn chill, as she contemplated the precariousness of her position. The bitter lessons of Catherine of Aragon's fading favour were never far from her mind, nor the fate of Mary's former reputation. Each move she made, every scholarly gathering she sponsored, every prayer book she authorised was also a precautionary measure, binding the king's reforms even more tightly to her own person. Anne's struggle was not merely to sit upon a throne, but to maintain her claim in a court teeming with ambition and intrigue. Courtiers schemed behind tapestries depicting the Tudor rose, their whispers like rustling leaves in a windless wood. In the silent anterooms of Whitehall, Advisors discussed alliances and betrayals over teacups of spiced wine, while Anne negotiated marriage settlements and land grants to shore up her family's fortunes. She brokered pensions for loyal servants, arranged dowries for her kin, and sought to place her supporters in key ecclesiastical posts, each move a ripple in the intricate network of power that sustained her throne. Despite the din of opposition, Anne's short reign yielded lasting contributions. Her endorsement of the English Bible paved the way for congregations to claim their spiritual heritage in their native tongue. The dissolution of monastic lands, though harsh in its execution, redistributed wealth that would later fuel the growth of grammar schools and charitable institutions across the countryside. In university towns, lectures in English began supplanting the old Latin curriculum, nurturing a generation of thinkers attuned to both humanist learning and reformed theology. Yet Anne's legacy was not solely measured in policies or texts. It endured in the very air of the realm, the way church bells summoned congregants to English services, the manner in which candlelit chapels echoed with voices raised in a new common tongue, the rhythm of daily life subtly altered by a faith no longer tethered exclusively to Rome. In towns from Dover to Durham, artisans found inspiration in the narratives of a queen whose intellect and resolve had shattered ecclesiastical chains, even as she herself navigated the frail vessel of her mortality. When Anne's final days approached, the same court that once lauded her reforming zeal turned with brutal swiftness to condemnation. Yet even in those last moments, her impact remained undeniable. A church reconstituted in English, a nation redefined, and a queen whose 3 years on the throne roiled centuries of precedent. In the quietude of history's reflective glow, Anne Boleyn's brief but brilliant reign stands as testament to the power of intellect, conviction, and the indomitable will to shape one's own destiny amid the tempests of faith and politics. In the fragile tapestry of Anne Boleyn's rise and reign, the single thread that unravelled her destiny was her inability to provide King Henry VIII with a son. Though she had borne the king a daughter, Princess Elizabeth, in the month of September 1533, Anne's hopes of securing her position through the birth of a male heir were dashed time and again. As the soft autumn sun filtered through the mullioned windows of Greenwich Palace in 1534, Anne endured her first miscarriage. Surrounded by the hush of velvet drapes and the muted glow of brass lanterns, she lay upon a carved oak bed, its embroidered canopy heavy with the scent of nightshade and lavender. Gowned in a robe of midnight blue, she had already felt the stirrings of life within her, only to be visited by a sorrow both private and profound. The court's physicians, clad in brocade doublets and linen coifs, hovered with their earthenware bowls and spiced waters, muttering Latin charms, while the queen gripped a silver crucifix. Outside, the clipped yew hedges of the palace gardens rustled in a hollow autumn wind, echoing the hollow ache in Anne's heart. Courtiers whispered that such a misfortune was least expected of a woman so favoured by the king, and rumours drifted through the corridors like ghostly shadows. Yet Anne, steeled by her faith and by the memory of her daughter's bright eyes, mourned quietly, renewing her prayers for God's mercy and for the promise of a son. When spring dawned in 1535, Anne once more carried hope beneath her heart. The palace chapel at Hampton Court saw her kneel repeatedly before the altar, her long dark sleeve slipping from a slender wrist as she rose to receive communion. Sermons preached of divine providence and the sanctity of marriage, and priests in black cassocks offered solemn blessings. Yet the fruit of her womb remained elusive, and in the pale light of dawn, as snow melted from the leaded glass panes, Anne suffered a second miscarriage, the loss of a male fetus that might have secured her future. The hush that fell upon the court that morning was as deep as any November dusk. Gentlewomen vying for her favour in days past now spoke in hushed undertones. They did not dare approach the Queen's chamber, where the scent of crushed rose petals mingled with tears. Henry's fervent desire for a son grew cold without a male child to comfort his anxieties. He who had once showered Anne with perfumes from Arabia and silks woven in Florence now drifted away, his once liquorous laughter and courtly feasts replaced by a stern rigidity. In summer 1535, diners at Greenwich endured his silence as they supped upon roast venison and honeyed puddings. Beneath gilt chandeliers, Anne sat with perfectly composed posture, her dark hair wound in a French coif, but the king's gaze evaded her. Like a foolish child seeking consolation, She failed to capture his eye, and the gilded halls echoed with the clatter of abandoned conversations. In the midst of this growing chill, Anne's political adversaries found their opportunity. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's shrewd and feared chief minister, moved quietly through the labyrinthine corridors of power, his cloak of sable velvet absorbing the torchlight as he carried messages to sympathetic peers. In the gallery outside the Privy Chamber, where tapestries of Henry's triumphs hung heavy and dim, Cromwell whispered his designs. He saw in Anne's vulnerability not simply a queen in distress, but an obstacle to his own ambitions. Her advocacy for a Protestant-leaning reformation clashed with Cromwell's pragmatic approach, and her wavering favour with the king provided him with the perfect pretext. By the month of April 1536, Cromwell's machinations had gained momentum. Within a chamber at Whitehall Palace, carved with heraldic beasts and echoing with the quiet rustle of parchment, he convened trusted agents. They pored over testimonies obtained in shadowed taverns and manor houses, coaxing secret recollections from frightened maids and embittered courtiers alike. The evidence they assembled was absurdly spurious. Tales of adultery with courtiers, including the Queen's own brother, George Boleyn, unfounded allegations of treason, plotting the king's demise in furtive midnight councils, and even whispers of witchcraft, as if Anne had summoned dark forces to ensnare the king's devotion. On the morning of the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne was summoned from her lodgings at Greenwich and conveyed to the Tower of London. The summer sun shone too brightly that day, as if mocking her plight, casting stark shadows across the ancient stones. Guards in steel cuirasses and torqued helmets marched 2 by 2, their halberds glinting in the reluctant light. Anne's procession passed beneath towering walls where moss and ivy clung in damp clusters. The air carried the briny tang of the nearby Thames, and the air of the river carried faint echoes of fishermen's cries and the creak of river barges. Within the tower's sullen embrace, Anne was confined to the very chamber she had known during her final days as queen. The same heavy tapestries that had once insulated her from the cold now enveloped her in a harsher solitude. William Kingston, the constable, delivered the summons with grave courtesy, his embroidered doublet black as a sorrowing night. Anne, clad in a modest gown of steel grey, faced her captors with a calm that belied the storm within. Her dark eyes, once alight with regal confidence, now shone with a mixture of defiance and resignation. Behind the heavy oaken door, her ladies-in-waiting gathered what few personal effects she was allowed to keep: her small prayer book, a silver box of relics, and a lock of Princess Elizabeth's golden curls. Outside, in the Tower Green, the crowd that had once cheered her coronation now watched in silent anticipation. Market vendors closed their stalls. Children peeked from behind wooden posts. The atmosphere, usually convivial with the shouts of traders and the clang of smithies, held a distant, strained quiet. Even the ravens perched upon the battlements seemed still, their inky forms poised against the pale sky. Anne's arrest was but a prelude to her trial, a spectacle orchestrated not by justice but by the ruthless calculus of power. The charges, concocted in a haze of envy and fear, carried the weight of treason, a crime that demanded the severest punishment. In the hushed corridors of Westminster Hall, where judges in solemn robes read the indictments, Anne's fate was swiftly sealed. She stood at the bar, surrounded by men she had once counted as friends, their faces drawn tight with disdain or indifference. The carved wooden panels of the hall, each depicting a monarch's triumph, seemed to mock her downfall. For Henry, whose heart had once beat with the fervour of love and the royal promise of an heir, the Queen's miscarriage of a male child had unleashed a series of events that even he, in his regal authority, could not control. It was the single failure upon which all else hinged. Anne's inability to bear a son shattered the fragile bond between them, leaving her exposed in a court rife with intrigue. With her protector's affection waning, her enemies pounced, and Cromwell's network of spies and informers turned rumour into verdict. As evening shadows lengthened across the Tower Green, Anne Boleyn, once the very embodiment of Tudor ambition and reform, found herself a prisoner once more, this time for crimes she never committed. The same ancient stones that had echoed with her coronation litanies now bore witness to her downfall. In the quiet that followed her arrest, the realm held its breath, unaware that within days This woman, who had shaped a nation's spiritual destiny, would stand upon a scaffold of pale wood and face the inexorable blade that would end her 3 years as queen. After the final echo of the executioner's sword on the scaffold had faded, a new decree rippled through the court and kingdom. Anne Boleyn's memory was to be expunged. In the galleries of royal palaces, from Whitehall's echoing corridors to the sunlit banqueting hall at Hampton Court, her likeness was systematically effaced. Artists were ordered to repaint over her portrait panels, recasting her image as blank tapestries, or replacing her visage with that of another consort. In the heavy oak frames that once cradled her regal smile, only shadowed outlines remained, as if time itself sought to blot out every trace of her existence. Servants carrying rackets and sponges swept away pigments, while court painters, trembling beneath the king's command, overlaid her face with lighter flesh tones borrowed from images of Jane Seymour. Thus, within weeks of her death on the 19th of May, 1536, the very visual record of Anne's life and reign began to vanish. Yet even amidst this orchestrated erasure, one contemporary likeness survived, the so-called Most Happy Medal, struck in the waning months of Anne's life, probably to celebrate her second pregnancy, and the eagerly anticipated birth of a male heir. This small bronze medallion bore her profile in crisp relief. In candlelit workshops, craftsmen laboured over delicate dyes, imprinting her features onto metal discs. Around the edge, the Latin legend proclaimed her virtues: Anna Regina Mater, Allegra, Anne the Queen, most joyful mother. Though the medal fell into obscurity as Anne's fortunes dimmed, it escaped the purges that consumed her painted portraits. It lay hidden among the treasures of private collectors, its bronze surface growing dull with centuries of neglect. It was in the late 19th century that the Most Happy Medal re-emerged, breathing life back into her vanished face. An ardent historian named Lucy Churchill, working by the smoky glow of gas lamps in a cluttered London study, first traced the medal's provenance. She discovered a single specimen in a dusty drawer of the British Museum's numismatic collection, its edges worn soft by time. With painstaking care, Churchill made rubbings and cast moulds, then consulted surviving descriptions of Anne's features from contemporary letters and diaries. In the quiet of her workshop, she sketched her reconstructions, layer upon layer, until the pale curves of Anne's cheekbones, the slope of her forehead, and the gentle arc of her jaw took shape once more. The result was a portrait that seemed to peer out of the past. Dark hair parted neatly beneath a coif, eyes that held both resolve and vulnerability, and lips that curved with the hint of queenly confidence. But the story of Anne's physical legacy did not end with bronze and ink. In 11,876, 1876 by the reckoning of modern historians, the hallowed stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula yielded another clue. During renovations ordered by Queen Victoria's government, labourers pried up flagstones and uncovered a small burial crypt beneath the choir's eastern end. There lay a female skeleton, hastily interred in an unmarked grave. The bones were delicate yet unmistakably human, vertebrae so small they matched the whispered tales of Anne's tiny neck, a skull with a slender jaw and a high forehead, consistent with the crown of courtly coiffure, and long limb bones, suggesting a height of between 5 feet and 5 feet 3 inches, or in metric terms, roughly 1.52 to 1.60 meters. Anatomists summoned to the site measured the remains by candle and by early gaslight, noting the absence of any extra phalange, thus disproving the lurid rumours of an extra finger that had circulated after Anne's fall. Yet even this discovery sparked debate. Some scholars posited that the skeleton might belong not exclusively to Anne, but perhaps to one of her close companions, Lady Jane Rochford, the wife of George Boleyn, who herself had fallen from grace and been executed not long after her sister. Others even suggested the remains could be those of Queen Catherine Howard, another young consort laid to rest in the same memorial chapel with little ceremony. The absence of a marked tomb and the haste of burial, an improvised arrow box rather than a proper coffin, only fueled the uncertainty. In the years that followed, anatomists and historians pored over every detail. In lecture halls at Oxford, students in stiff academic gowns debated the merits of using dental forensics versus pelvic morphology to confirm identity. By the pale electric glare of lanterns, They catalogued each rib and femur, cross-referencing Tudor-era burial records and the scant notes left by Anthony Weldon, a chronicler who visited the chapel as early as 1622. Photographs of the bones, taken by flickering film plates, circulated among museums in Paris, Berlin, and London, each institution weighing in on the question of provenance. Meanwhile, Lucy Churchill's reconstructions gained wider circulation. Antique dealers in Oxford Street displayed high-carat brass replicas of the medal for eager tourists, and small prints of her painted likeness adorned the parlour walls of historical societies in Birmingham and Bath. In candlelit reading rooms, visitors traced Churchill's lines with gloved fingers, marvelling at how accurately they seemed to reflect the descriptions of ambassadors and poets from centuries past. Back at the tower, where once Anne had awaited her fate, visitors now paused before the simple glass marker embedded in the grass of the green. The inscription read, "Here fell Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, May 19th, 1536. Each anniversary, mourners laid roses and wildflowers, a profusion of crimson petals that seemed to echo the vibrant underdress she had chosen for her execution. The pale glass allowed the damp English air to patter upon each remembrance, as if the very sky wept for her. Today, technological advances offer tantalizing possibilities. DNA analysis, though hampered by the lack of living Boleyn descendants, hints at potential breakthroughs. Crumbs of genetic material, if discovered on ribbons preserved in private collections, might one day confirm the skeleton's identity. Until then, we rely on the confluence of archaeology, numismatics, and painstaking historical scholarship to reconstruct her visage and her story. No painted portrait from her lifetime survives in unaltered form. Only the most happy medal sits, like a solitary beacon, linking us to her living breath. And the bones, whispered to be hers, rest silently under ancient stones, offering a fragile testament to a queen who was at once radiant in her reforms and tragic in her demise. In the ebb and flow of historical memory, Anne Boleyn endures in metal, in bone, and in the silent spaces where once her likeness smiled from gilded frames, waiting to be seen again. After Anne Boleyn's head fell, and her tiny body was hastily interred beneath the cold stones of the chapel floor, a sweeping edict echoed through palace and priory alike. Her memory was to be wiped clean. In the grand galleries of Whitehall Palace, where gilded walls had borne witness to her laughter and her gentle gestures, court artists were ordered to paint over her likeness. Portraits that once captured her dark hair and keen eyes were scrubbed, then overlaid with the features of a newer consort, as if to erase every trace of the fallen queen. In the quiet cloisters of Westminster Abbey, and in the hushed halls of Glastonbury, the frescoes depicting royal patronage were retouched to remove her name. Her very shadow seemed to vanish from the stone reliefs and stained glass panels. Even chapter records in monastic ledgers, once meticulous in cataloguing gifts and endowments, were updated to excise her contributions. What began as a single severance became a systematic purge, designed to whitewash history itself. Yet this carefully orchestrated campaign of oblivion did not succeed in burying Anne Boleyn's legacy. Among the ashes of her erased image, one small artifact endured, the bronze medallion known as the Most Happy Medal. Struck during her lifetime, most likely to commemorate her second pregnancy and the hopeful expectancy of a male heir, this tiny disc bore her profile in crisp relief. Its smooth surface, rimmed with the Latin legend Regina Felicissima Mater, Queen Most Joyful Mother, escaped the king's purge, concealed for centuries in private collections and numismatic archives. Only in the late 19th century did this slender link to the past re-emerge, its contours offering a rare glimpse of Anne's visage unaltered by later hands. By the year 1876, the winds of antiquarian interest had reached the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, perched within the walls of the Tower of London. Government-led renovations undertaken at Queen Victoria's behest pried up ancient flagstones to reveal a hitherto unnoticed burial crypt in the choir's eastern end. Beneath layers of mortar and centuries of footsteps lay a simple, unmarked grave. When workers gently lifted the stones, they found a female skeleton laid to rest in haste, its bones stark against the dark earth. In the torchlit gloom, anatomists knelt beside the remains, their brushes sweeping away dust and debris with reverent care. They discovered a stature of between 5 feet and 5 feet 3 inches, a skull of delicate proportions, and vertebrae so small that they matched contemporary accounts of Anne's petite neck. No extra digit appeared on any finger bones, thus dispelling later rumours of a deformity that had plagued her memory. Yet the identity of these bones remains a subject of scholarly debate, for nearby lay the graves of Lady Rochford and of Catherine Howard, two other tragic figures hastily interred without markers. In the cold silence of the crypt, identification depended only on the subtle clues of bone structure and the scant notes of 16th century diarists. While archaeology laid bare the physical remnants, a renewed passion for portraiture arose some miles away in a dimly lit London studio. Lucy Churchill, a self-taught artist and historian, encountered the most happy medal at the British Museum and felt the stir of recognition. Under gaslight that flickered like distant starlight, she made meticulous tracings of the medallion's relief, then began the laborious task of reconstructing Anne's face. Consulting descriptions penned by ambassadors at the French court, by Venetian envoys, and even by Tudor-era diarists whose words spoke of high cheekbones, deep dark eyes, and brows of pale promise, Churchill painted and repainted until her canvas betrayed no sign of guesswork. The result was a portrait that seemed to emerge from a veil of time, an oval face framed by glossy dark hair, small arches of brows, and eyes that reflected both her resolve and her vulnerability. News of Churchill's work spread through academic circles like dawn's gentle light seeping into a slumbering world. Small prints found their way into the parlours of the Society of Antiquaries and the lecture rooms of Oxford colleges. In parlours warmed by gas-fueled stoves, scholars and enthusiasts leaned over published lithographs, tracing the fine lines of Anne's reconstructed jaw and the poised curve of her neck. They whispered that Churchill's portrait had recaptured what state-sanctioned erasures could not, the living essence of a queen wronged by history itself. Yet Anne Boleyn's truest legacy lay not in the metal of a medallion, nor the pigment on a canvas, but in the life of her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Upon the death of Queen Mary, in the year 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne as Elizabeth I. In her coronation robes rich with velvet and ermine, her hair framed by pearls, she honoured her mother by restoring the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and commissioning a simple marble marker over the crypt. The site where her mother's body lay, unknown now, bore the testimonial words, "Here lies Anne, second wife of Henry VIII, deposed and beheaded." Thus, Elizabeth reclaimed her mother's place in the annals of royalty, drawing a line of continuity that no royal decree could sever. Elizabeth's reign, spanning 45 years and known ever since as the Golden Age, rested upon the uneasy foundation formed by Anne's blood and Anne's sacrifice. Under Elizabeth's rule, the Church of England found stability. The arts flourished in shimmering theatres and print shops, and England's naval power ventured into uncharted waters. The Queen's charismatic speeches in candlelit halls often alluded to a maternal influence, another layer of Anne's influence, whispered behind palace tapestries. Statues of Elizabeth gazed from pedestals across squares in London, Bristol and Norwich, their inscriptions honouring her virtues, but her very existence remained an echo of Anne's initial gamble for a crown. Each year, on the anniversary of Anne's execution, a silent procession winds its way across the Tower Green. Scholars, enthusiasts, and simple visitors gather at dawn, placing fresh roses at the spot where the scaffold once stood. The dew-laden grass bears each crimson petal as a sign of remembrance. A simple glass plaque, inserted into the worn stones, reads in dignified script, "Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, died May 19th, 1536. Here, beneath the watchful gaze of ancient walls, the act of commemoration becomes a communal prayer, a testament that even potentates cannot erase a life that shaped a nation." Thus, Anne Boleyn's story, her sudden fall, the erasures that followed, and the fragments reclaimed by time remains a parable. It reminds us that power can attempt to rewrite memory, but the pulse of influence and the resonance of sacrifice ripple through the ages. Through a solitary medal, a recovered skeleton, a painstaking portrait, and a daughter's mighty reign, Anne's spirit lives on. In that quiet dawn vigil, as roses lie upon the cold earth, we acknowledge that her legacy endures not in the halls of power that sought to forget her, but in the hearts of a people who choose to remember. Anne Boleyn's image in literature and legend has been woven into countless layers of meaning, each strand reflecting the hopes, fears, and ambitions of those who remember her. To her supporters of religious reform, she stands as a beacon of spiritual liberation, a woman who harnessed her influence to translate the Bible into English and open the scriptures to common folk. In the grand halls of Greenwich and Hampton Court, where the scent of incense had once mingled with the rustle of damask curtains, Anne patronised the first English-language sermons. Clergymen, some born of Oxford's cloistered colleges, others of village grammar schools, preached in the vernacular under vaulted ceilings, their voices echoing off carved oak pews. Villagers in woolen cloaks pressed forward, eyes wide, as they heard the word of God in their mother tongue for the very first time. This humble act of translation would resonate far beyond the palace walls, laying the foundation for the flowering of English Protestantism. Yet for every hymn sung in praise of her reform, a dirge was chanted in condemnation. The staunch defenders of papal authority, abbots, monks, and traditionalist courtiers saw in Anne a dire threat to the old order. In candlelit chapter houses, where hooded canons kept meticulous records of rituals and fasting days, her image was invoked as a symbol of heresy. These men, vested in black robes heavy with weighty silver crosses, whispered in the corridors of power that Anne was not merely misguided, but dangerously ambitious. Through pointed sermons and scurrilous pamphlets, they painted her as a conspirator, a woman who had seduced the king into abandoning the Holy Father. Torrents of rumour swirled. That she had plotted amorous liaisons with her brother, George Boleyn, beneath the Tudor moon. That she had conspired with foreign princes to overthrow the crown. That she had trafficked in sorcery to bind Henry's will to her own. Each falsehood flew on the wings of fear, a desperate attempt to shore up a collapsing bastion of clerical privilege. The contrast between acclaim and vilification could scarcely be more pronounced. Protestant historians such as William Brewster hailed her as a progressive angel, extolling her vision of an English church free from Roman chains. Brewster's own pamphlets, printed in modest quantities and distributed in London taverns, recounted Anne's insistence on reading the scriptures aloud to the common people, and her fondness for theological discussion around palace refectories. In stark opposition, Catholic chroniclers like Nicholas Sanders depicted her as a vile temptress, casting her ambition in the most lurid terms. Sanders's account, penned in exile and disseminated on the continent, described her as the very devil incarnate, whose manipulations had desecrated sacred marriage and imperiled the soul of the realm. His words, printed in heavy Gothic type, lent an air of dark gravitas to the accusations, ensuring that Anne's memory would be forever entangled with the clash between innovation and tradition. This cultural tug-of-war extended far beyond dusty archives into the heart of artistic creation. William Shakespeare, writing in the early 1700s, alluded to Anne's legacy in his histories. Though she seldom appeared by name, characters such as the formidable Queen Margaret in Henry VI bore echoes of Anne's fortitude and the tragic arc of her downfall. In Restoration theatres, where waxed floors gleamed beneath candlelight, actors, draped in velvet cloaks, delivered monologues of royal betrayal that reminded audiences of Anne's fate, each soliloquy a mirror to her courage and her suffering. Centuries later, Anne Boleyn's story found new life in the pages of modern novelists. Hilary Mantel's acclaimed Wolf Hall trilogy reimagined courtly intrigue with fresh eyes, recentering the narrative around Thomas Cromwell, but never forgetting Anne's magnetic presence. Mantel's pen evoked the scent of trimmed hedges at Hampton Court, the flicker of torchlight on damp stone walls, and the flickering anxiety of a queen awaiting her destiny. Readers lingering over these pages felt themselves drawn into Anne's world. The tick of the court clock in Westminster, the hush of embroidered tapestries swaying in hidden corridors, the distant toll of abbey bells signaling both dawn and doom. Hollywood, too, has illuminated Anne's complex legacy on the silver screen. In the black and white shadows of 1969's Anne of the Thousand Days, actress Genevieve Bujold embodied the Queen's blend of defiance and vulnerability. The camera lingered on her face, paler than porcelain in close-up, yet animated by a spark of inner fire, juxtaposed against the brooding silhouette of Henry VIII, played by Richard Burton. In modern times, Natalie Dormer's portrayal in the lavish series The Tudors brought yet another dimension, capturing Anne's sharp wit in barbed dialogue, her regal posture in sweeping court scenes, and the flicker of tenderness as she cradled her daughter's hand beneath embroidered velvet. Each retelling, whether in verse, novel, or film, adds a brushstroke to Anne Boleyn's portrait, sometimes flattering, sometimes damning, but always vivid. Her tale resonates today because it touches on universal themes: the quest for power, the price of ambition, and the fragility of justice when wielded by those who fear change. Audiences in modern theatres, electric lights glinting off polished seats, murmur in the dark as actors recount her final speech on the scaffold, a plea for mercy that transcends centuries. In university lecture halls, students debate the ethics of her trial, poring over legal records and contemporary reports, discovering in her ordeal a cautionary tale about the manipulation of truth. Yet beyond the spectacle of performance, commemorations of Anne Boleyn carry a quieter poignancy. At the Tower Green, where a simple glass plaque now marks the scaffold's former site, roses are laid each year on the 19th of May. Visitors, some clad in tweed coats on windswept spring mornings, others in tailored suits on solemn anniversaries, pay homage with petals that drip dew into the grass. The wind carries the faint echo of distant bells, and for a moment, the world seems to pause. Scholars stand nearby, notebooks in hand, tracing the lines of the plaque's inscription. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, died May 19, 1536. Even as tourists click cameras and chatter drifts through the air, there is an undercurrent of reverence, a collective acknowledgement that her story remains a vital thread in England's tapestry. In the end, Anne Boleyn's legacy endures not because she lived in a gilded cage, nor because she fell from its rafters, but because her life speaks to the resonant chords of human aspiration and suffering. She emerges from myth and propaganda as a figure both monumental and intimate, a reformer who dared to speak God's word in the tongue of the people, a woman whose voice rang out in candlelit chapels, and yet one whose fall revealed the savage calculus of power. Her memory, though threatened by the whitings out of royal decree, has refused oblivion. Through the pages of history, the echoes of her laughter and her prayers still drift. Through film and theatre, her silhouette walks again beneath vaulted ceilings. Through annual commemorations, her name is whispered in the grass. In each retelling, we find not only the tragedy of a discarded queen, but the enduring strength of a woman whose story teaches us that the quest for justice and the power of faith can outlast even the most determined attempts at erasure. In the long shadows cast by the Tudor dynasty, the lives of Anne Boleyn and her daughter Elizabeth form a chiaroscuro of ambition, tragedy, and triumph. Anne, the catalyst of England's religious revolution, ignited the spark that would sever centuries-old ties to Rome, yet she never lived to see the embers of her reforms glow into a lasting flame. Elizabeth, crowned 23 years after her mother's execution, inherited not only the throne but the arduous task of solidifying the Church of England. Her reign of 45 years would come to be celebrated as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time of relative peace, cultural flourishing, and naval supremacy that bore the imprint of the revolution her mother had begun. It is tempting to imagine the two queens standing side by side, though time kept them ever apart. Anne's short tenure, barely 3 years in saffron-lit chapels and torch-lit banquet halls, was marked by bold strokes. The promotion of vernacular sermons in the Palace Chapel at Hampton Court, the encouragement of learned men to furnish English translations of Scripture, and the assertion that a monarch might rule without the approval of a foreign spiritual authority. These acts, daring as they were divisive, unsettled the very foundations of religious life. Anne's influence echoed in the crisp wind that swept along stone battlements as villagers in woolen cloaks pressed against the carved columns of their parish churches, hoping to catch a sermon in the tongue they spoke at home. Elizabeth, stepping into the royal procession beneath the fluttering banners of St. George's Cross, became the second act in her mother's drama. Her coronation in January of 1558 took place beneath a vaulted canopy in Westminster Abbey, where the pungent hum of incense had long since been replaced by a confident recital of the English Mass. In her flowing robes of ermine and velvet, she bore the same Tudor crown that had once rested upon Anne's brow, though centuries of legend had worn away every public record of her mother's appearance. Yet Elizabeth knew her heritage. She moved through the Abbey's aisles with measured grace, the mellow chime of her coronation bells signalling both continuity and renewal. Under Elizabeth's steady hand, the nascent Church of England found stability. In cloistered conference chambers, she authorized the 39 Articles of Faith, codifying doctrine that balanced Catholic tradition with Protestant reform. Beyond the sacristy doors, Church wardens in market towns like York and Canterbury pressed freshly printed service books into the hands of worshippers whose familiar Latin prayers had been swept into the dust of discontinuation. The realm, once torn between allegiance to Rome and devotion to the crown, now united under the aegis of a sovereign whose word carried both secular command and spiritual weight. Cultural achievements blossomed under Elizabeth's patronage, their roots tracing back to the foundations Anne had laid. In the courtyards of Oxford and Cambridge, scholars debated the merits of Platonic philosophy and Calvinist theology, secure in the knowledge that their queen would not turn them in for heresy. At sea, England's ships ventured farther than ever before. Francis Drake's galleons slipped through the fog off the Cornish coast, carrying news of distant lands as the roar of cannon fire echoed from captured Spanish galleons. Walter Raleigh's bold ventures to Guiana promised untold riches and colonies, ventures that found encouragement at courtly banquets where Elizabeth herself presided. The sails that billowed across restless waters owed their wind to a stability in church and state, a stability Anne had compelled Henry to endorse through his act of supremacy. Yet the relationship between mother and daughter was never merely political. It was profoundly personal. Elizabeth's childhood, spent under the wary gaze of courtiers who whispered of her mother's execution and her own precarious legitimacy, was shaped by loss and longing. The corridors of Hatfield House, where she lived as a princess, held no portraits of Anne Boleyn. Only later, as queen, did Elizabeth order the refurbishing of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Beneath the slate roof, and within cold stone walls, she saw to it that Anne's unmarked grave would at last bear a dignified marker. With her own hand, she commissioned a marble slab reading, "Here lies Anne, second wife of Henry VIII, executed but not forgotten." Each chisel stroke in the workshop by the tower echoed with the daughter's resolve to restore her mother's place in history. In official annals, Elizabeth revised the royal chronicle, restoring Anne's name to lists of queens. She designated the 19th of May as a day of reflection, ensuring that every year courtiers would pause in their duties to remember the mother whose sacrifice had made possible the stability they now enjoyed. Thus Elizabeth gave Anne a legacy that transcended the ephemeral decrees of Henry VIII. She bestowed upon her a place in the collective memory that no purge of portraits or burnings of manuscripts could erase. The cultural pantheon would remember both women in distinct yet intertwined ways. In Shakespeare's dramas, Anne's fall became a cautionary note in history plays, while Elizabeth's reign inspired the lyric grandeur of his later sonnets. In Hilary Mantel's novels, Anne emerges in trenchant detail as a pioneer of reform, her voice resonating amid treaties and intrigue, while Elizabeth's presence forms a regal counterpoint. On screens both large and small, actresses have portrayed Anne's fierce intelligence and Elizabeth's poised authority in stark juxtaposition, each queen reflecting the other's strengths and vulnerabilities. The story of Anne and Elizabeth thus forms an arc of transformation. Anne, the revolutionary, prefigured and provoked the break with Rome. Elizabeth, the consolidator, guided the nation into a new epoch of religious confidence and imperial aspiration. One sparked the journey, the other charted its course together. Mother and daughter wove the tapestry of a kingdom reborn. Even as winds tremble across the Tower Green and the plaque marking Anne's execution catches the early morning dew, the silhouette of Elizabeth's statue in the Parliament Square stands resolute, both monuments testifying to a legacy that time cannot tarnish. In the final reckoning, the comparison of Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I reveals more than a mere matrilineal link. It unveils a dynamic partnership across generations. Anne, the impulsive architect of revolution, and Elizabeth, the deliberate steward of its promises. Anne's sacrifice became the bedrock upon which Elizabeth erected a realm that blazed with learning, art, and maritime power. Their combined story reminds us that history's grandest achievements often hinge on the risk-taking of one generation and the steady hands of the next, each queen indispensable, each queen unforgettable, in the unfolding saga of England. The death of Anne Boleyn on the 19th of May, 1536, did not mark the end of her story, but rather the beginning of an immortal legacy. In the damp pre-dawn hours when the Tower Green lay shrouded in mist, Anne's life was extinguished by a single stroke of the sword. Yet as dawn broke over the Thames, her name began a journey that would weave through centuries of literature, art, and collective memory. To some, she is a heroic figure, a woman of conviction who dared to defy both Pope and Patriarch. To others, she is portrayed as a villainous, ambitious, manipulative, and the architect of her own downfall. But regardless of perspective, Anne Boleyn remains unforgettable. In the grand sweep of English history, Anne's influence cannot be overstated. She was the catalyst for Henry VIII's decisive break from the Roman Church, a rupture that echoed through cathedral aisles and cloistered libraries alike. Under her subtle guidance, the king embraced the notion that no foreign prelate could dictate England's spiritual destiny. Across the green roofs of village churches, from the thatch-roofed parish in Somerset to the stone steeple in Kent, congregations heard the first tremors of reform. Latin prayers giving way to English hymns, ancient rituals yielding to vernacular readings of scripture. Monasteries, once hubs of medieval tradition, fell silent as their lands and treasures passed to the crown. The religious landscape of England was transformed. An upheaval Anne Boleyn had set in motion even before she donned her crown. Beyond the realm of theology, Anne embodied a new model of female agency. In courtly circles where ladies crafted silk embroidery and played virginal music, she stood apart by insisting on the terms of her own destiny. "I will not be your mistress," she is said to have told Henry. "If you wish to have me, you must crown me." This audacious declaration, echoing through the carved wood panels of Whitehall Palace, became a rallying cry for women's self-determination. Generations of commentators, from early pamphleteers to modern feminist scholars, have seized upon her words as a clarion call, that a woman's worth is measured not by subservience, but by the respect accorded to her ambitions. The phrase, "crown or nothing," has since entered the lexicon as shorthand for personal dignity and the right to demand equality. The arts of the 20th and 21st centuries have continued to rediscover and reimagine Anne's complex persona. The 1969 film Anne of the Thousand Days, with its chiaroscuro cinematography and sumptuous costuming, portrayed her as both passionate lover and political insurgent, her every glance charged with the tension of forbidden authority. In the glossy episodes of The Tudors, 2007 to 2010, Natalie Dormer rendered Anne's sharp wit and vulnerability with electric intensity, her voice resonating in candlelit chambers as she sparred with scheming nobles. More recently, the BBC's documentary series has traced the archaeological unearthing of her forgotten grave, combining the hush of the excavation site with the poignant narration of historians who recount Anne's final hours. Each artistic portrayal, whether on celluloid or in print, brings the Tudor court's grandeur and terror back to life. One can almost smell the damp ivy clinging to the tower's battlements, hear the clink of goblets in the great hall of Hampton Court, and feel the hush of a congregation as Anne stood to speak in English for the first time. These vivid reconstructions remind us that although her body lies beneath cold stone, her spirit strides across stages and pages, inspiring audiences to revisit the questions she posed about power, faith, and the rights of women. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn stands as a symbol of will and the quest for change. In the volatile 16th century, marked by courtly intrigue and shifting alliances, she was a standard-bearer for a new order, one in which the sovereign's authority was absolute, and the people's spiritual welfare was no longer dictated by distant pontiffs. Her death on the scaffold may have seemed a tragic conclusion, but it also cast her as a martyr in the cause of reform. The crown that fell from her head rolled into the annals of history, its significance magnified by her daughter Elizabeth's subsequent 45-year reign. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, carried forward the religious settlement her mother ignited, guiding England into an era of global exploration, artistic flourishing, and naval supremacy. Today, on cold spring mornings, visitors cluster around the simple glass plaque on the Tower Green that reads, "Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, died May 19th, 1536. They place roses at the spot where once her life was claimed, leaving petals that glisten with dew like tiny jewels. In those quiet moments, the din of modern London fades, and one can almost hear the distant echo of Henry's court, the rustle of Anne's silken skirts, the fervour of her final prayer. Her legacy endures in the centuries of English church life, in the chorus of women who invoke her courage, and in every artistic reimagining that seeks to capture her indomitable spirit. So it is that Anne Boleyn's story, born of royal ambition and cut short by political necessity, lives on as an enduring testament to the power of one woman's vision. She reminds us that even when courts conspire to obliterate a memory, the truth can surface again in bronze and bone, in canvas and script, and in the hearts of those who remember. Her life and death, woven into England's fabric, continue to spark reflection on the precarious balance between authority and conscience, between tradition and transformation. And in that restless current of history, Anne Boleyn remains forever a torchbearer, illuminating the path for all who dare to challenge the limits of their age. And so, as the echoes of Anne Boleyn's extraordinary life begin to soften into the quiet hush of memory, we can gently let the vivid colours of her journey drift into a soothing twilight. From her noble birth and youthful days in the gilded courts of France, through the shimmering heights of queenship and the heartbreaking hush of that final dawn, Anne's story reminds us that true change often comes at a great cost. Yet her courage, her unwavering conviction to speak her truth, demand her crown, and reshape a nation's faith lives on as a testament to the power of one determined soul. In the gentle glow of candlelight, let your thoughts wander to the green grass of the Tower, where roses still bloom each May 19th in her honour, and imagine the daughter she left behind, who built upon that foundation to preside over an age of peace and discovery. Feel the comforting assurance that history's erasures could not completely silence Anne's legacy, for in every whispered sermon in English, in every scholarly thesis and museum exhibit, her spirit finds new life. May her story bring you a sense of calm wonder, and remind you that, even in the face of adversity, the human heart can blaze with purpose. As you close your eyes tonight, let the rhythm of centuries-old prayers and the soft rustle of silken gowns carry you into a gentle slumber. And when you awake, may you carry with you the quiet strength of a woman who dared to change her world. Sleep well, dear listener. And should you wish to journey with us again through history's hidden corners and grandest epics, please subscribe to our channel for more of the very best stories that time has to offer. Good night. And may your dreams be as boundless as Anne's legacy.